Hi, thanks for coming to the channel. I hope you're all well. The 27th of January was Holocaust Memorial Day. I think that date's chosen because it was the day that Auschwitz was liberated in 1945, 77 years this year. Um, it's far enough back that the survivors are now getting older, but it's still close enough within living memory that there are still a number of survivors around. This year I had an indirect link actually to a Holocaust survivor. I never met her, but someone I was getting close to as a friend was a carer for this lady who now lives in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and I've heard second-hand accounts that she's quite open about it. I find with great trauma there's sort of mixed reactions. It's a bit like soldiers who go through war, some of them are open about their experiences, others not so. And I think that's true of Holocaust survivors as well. Um, anyway, there's a few things I want to talk about just around the subject. Um, the Yad Vashem Center in Israel, which commemorates, it's I think the world's biggest commemorative museum, and also council for the righteous among the nations. That is people who helped Jews during the war, non-Jews who helped Jews during the war. Um, they have a program which is quite interesting. It's called I Remember Wall, and if you check out their website, I'll put a link on this video. Basically, it's just a way to keep the memory alive, not just of the tragedy of the Shoah, but of thousands of individual lives, hundreds of thousands of individual lives. There's still a lot of Holocaust victims whose biographies are quite vague and whose fate is not well documented. Obviously, there's famous victims like Anne Frank, but there's many others who are not so well documented. Um, and basically, what this does is it makes sure it doesn't become forgotten, which is very important. So it's very easy to use. You just type in your name and country, and they randomly match you to a person. So I done this. It literally takes about 5 seconds, and they matched me to someone called Dobie Reutman. There's not much information on her. From what I could see in the picture, she's an older woman. She was a hotel owner in Dubno, Poland, and she was married. And it says that she was murdered in the Shoah. There's no other information about her lifespan, precisely when she was murdered or in which camp. Um, Most Holocaust victims probably died in extermination camps, but many others, of course, died in massacres and prison uprisings and so on. Um, Anyone interested in the subject, it makes it's interesting, but of course, it's harrowing. I think this project is interesting. It's a way of keeping up the memory in the public sort of radar. Um, so check it out. Um, But on the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day, and whether this was a coincidence or not, I don't know. But footage emerged from Tottenham in North London of two elderly Jewish men who were violently attacked by a thug. He was walking down the high street, tall guy, black. I just randomly punched these elderly men. They were both hospitalised. He has been arrested, and I hope he gets a stiff sentence. But anyone who thinks that anti-Semitism is dead isn't paying attention. Of course, all forms of bigotry is wrong and terrible, but I think there's something particularly insidious about this anti-Jewish worldview. Of course, Jewish people are individuals, um, but there's something about this collective hatred, hostility towards the Jewish people, which is abhorrent. Absolutely abhorrent. I mean, no one can rationally deny that the Jews as a people have been persecuted throughout history. Um, just to look a bit at history, here in the UK and specifically England, we're not completely without a past. there isn't much documentation of Jewish people before the Norman conquest, but there was quite sizable populations in medieval cities like London, York, Norwich, and just a quick bit of history here. In the Middle Ages, there was a number of cases of so-called blood libels, whereby young Christian children were murdered or died in mysterious circumstances, and they became kind of focus of cult. So these sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories go way, way back. Um, and of course, with the passage of time, we'll never really know what happened in those cases, whether it was a Christian who committed the murders and blamed the Jews, whether it was an individual Jew, and then the wider Jewish community um, feared collective blaming and so on. So some examples of this are Little Saint Hugh of Lincoln, uh, Saint Robert of Gloucester. I think the first example was in I forget now, but there was at least four such cases where child kind of Christian martyrs became cult figures. And things like this, of course, fueled anti-Semitism. The Black Death, of course, brought a wave of persecution because it was so the Jews were scapegoated for that, and there were whole-scale massacres in France and Germany and elsewhere. Um, Although it wasn't quite as bad in England, we did have our share of pogroms, and I've come across at least four. 1189, the coronation of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. Um, there was a pogrom in London in which Jews were targeted and killed. The same year, such a pogrom took place in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. 57 were killed. 1190, York, the famous incident at Clifford's Tower, it's now a fortification, where at least 150 Jewish people took their own lives rather than be killed by the mob. And then in 1265 in London, upwards of 500 Jews were killed. So we're certainly not without a past in that sense. Um, Under the Cromwell era, um, Jews were allowed back into England. They'd been expelled by Edward I in 1290. So, although I don't think our history is quite as dark as what you see in continental Europe, we're not without a history. And, to see sometimes, for example, the modern Middle East conflicts, very often, and I don't want to detract too much into this because, it would take lots of videos, but very often I do think that what Israel does, and people can have the views on that. I do think it's used as an excuse for anti-Semitism. An example of this is when the conflict was going on last year. And, I'm not someone who says that Israel should never be criticised. That's not my position. But I do think unquestionably it is used as an excuse for anti-Semitism. When you had thugs last year literally, taunting Jews on the streets of London and um, coming out with anti-Semitic slogans and all sorts of things. There is clearly still a poisonous mindset out there. All you have to do is look at cyberspace to see the amount of Holocaust denial that is out there. And it's easy to dismiss this as kind of neo-Nazi forums of the internet, but I have seen in my own life I've seen Holocaust denial. People who are not necessarily neo-Nazis, but they start going down that rabbit hole of believing that it's all some sort of conspiracy. And that's very disturbing, and it only reiterates why the Shoah does need to be remembered. Of course, the Shoah wasn't the only crime against humanity in World War II. I also think it's important to remember communist atrocities. For example, the estimated 100,000 killed in the NKVD prisoner massacres, the Katyn Forest massacre, in which the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, killed 22,000 Polish officers, and of course a lot more. So I do think it's important to remember communist crimes. Um, I mean, communism killed tens of millions of people in the 20th century. In China, the crimes in Mao Zedong are still largely covered up. And I hope one day that China will accept the past. Um, But there is the thing about the Holocaust, and of course, Jews weren't the only victims. There were Slavs, there were Romani, the disabled, homosexuals. Um, but there was something about the Holocaust. I think the reason it does stand out is unlike the gulags and unlike the Cultural Revolution in China, there was a systematic mass murder within the Holocaust. There was the final solution. Now, with the Gulag, it was an equally horrendous system in terms of the miserable conditions, but it was sort of like a rotationary system. I'm reading a book, Gulag, by Anna Applebaum, and although it's it should obviously be remembered as well, there is something about the finality of the Holocaust that is almost unique in terms of. I'm not talking about genocide. There have been other genocides, Rwanda, the Armenian genocide, but the scale of the Holocaust, and I think the efficiency in terms of, I mean, Auschwitz is well known, but Belzec was an even higher proportion of mortality. I don't mean overall deaths, but in terms of the proportionality. That's why it's much less documented than Auschwitz because it was so effective in terms of what it done. Whereas there was more survivors from Auschwitz overall. But in that sense, the Holocaust is unique. Now, Mao and Stalin may have killed more than Hitler, but I do think the Holocaust was unique in terms of, I mean, it's estimated 1.5 million child victims. I don't think it was that many child victims in the Cultural Revolution or even in the Gulag system. And this is not to downplay communist atrocities. I personally think they're underplayed, actually. I think we should have a museum to communist terror as well. But when you get woke activists constantly talking about the crimes of colonialism and the crimes of the transatlantic slave trade, um, a Jewish academic pointed out these efforts to try and actually not Jewish academic, um, the Israeli ambassador to Britain pointed out um, these attempts to reassess Churchill and try and pull down his legacy. Winston Churchill stood up to that system. Now, wherever you think of World War II, I think the cause of standing up to that system, and of course there was a lot of motivating factors for what influenced World War II, but one of them was to stand up against the genocidal Third Reich. I don't think anyone could rationally argue that wasn't just war. War is never good, but if ever there was a cause, surely that was one. Um, I might watch Schindler's List again. I've never done a film review of Schindler's List simply because I'm not sure I can add much more. It's obviously a very famous film. There's been many films made about the Holocaust, but Schindler's List is it's one of the greatest films ever made. And you get people on cyberspace who still will say it never happened, never happened. And I find that chilling. And these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories directly influence what happened in Tottenham the other day. And I'm not saying that this fag who attacked the men knew it was Holocaust Memorial Day, but when you get Jewish sites, even today, you get Holocaust memorials that are vandalized with swastikas. This has happened in Germany. Um, it makes my stomach turn. Um, of course, all forms of bigotry need to be confronted, but take, for example, there have been attempts to say, well, Islamophobia needs to get the same recognition as anti-Semitism. I would say all forms of bigotry need to be challenged. I would say that anti-Muslim bigotry, hate crimes, of course, they need to be dealt with seriously. But I would also point out there's no comparison. There has not been, um, at least in the Western world, an attempt to exterminate the entire Muslim population in the same way, to the same extent. Probably the closest we come to is Srebrenica. Today, we say history shouldn't repeat what China is doing to the Uyghurs. For me, it just reiterates why we must stand up to China. So far, there hasn't been mass extermination, but I would call it a cultural genocide. Certainly, the forced sterilization of Uyghur women. But in terms of the nature of the Holocaust, I think it is almost unique because other genocides certainly deserve attention. I mean, the Rwandan genocide was over a much shorter period of time. It was over about 6 months. The Holocaust, of course, over 12 years. Um, and, it's right that that is recognised. But I do think that the nature of the Holocaust is unique when you compare it to other totalitarian systems. Within the communist system, I think one reason actually why communist systems get overall less attention, particularly China, is most of the victims of that were Chinese. So it wasn't ethnically based. Today's crimes against the Uyghurs is, which is why there are sinister echoes to the 1930s. But for example, most of Mao's victims were Han Chinese people, and many of them were members of the Communist Party. I think that's why it doesn't get the same recognition because, of course, with Hitlerism and the Third Reich, you had the Holocaust, you also had millions of Polish and other Slavic victims and whole scale slaughter by the Einsatzgruppen and SS in occupied Eastern Europe. So I think that's why it's better documented because a lot of the victims were minorities and they were non Germans. So again, the nature of it's different. With the communist systems, most of the victims probably are within those systems. Soviet Union's perhaps a bit different from China because you had a lot of Ukrainian victims. The Holodomor, of course, is a very, very sensitive issue in Ukraine, and I believe it should be more recognised. I'm starting to see a little bit more of that happening. I can think of two films about the Holodomor. Uh, Mr. Jones, about the Welsh journalist Gareth Jones, who helped to expose this, and Bitter Harvest. I haven't seen it yet, but that's also a more modern film about the Holodomor. It's in English, which got mixed reviews. Some said that it should have been in Ukrainian, but actually, being in English gives it more focus. I would say the same reason with Schindler's List. The fact that Schindler's List was an English language film, you had the Jews, you had the Nazis, they were all speaking in English. It gives more mainstream attention in a sense, in a way that an independent film wouldn't. So sometimes there is merit in that mainstream approach. Anyway, I'm going to round this up, but anti-Semitism totally disgusts me. I think it's very possible to criticize the state of Israel or criticize individual Jewish people. I mean, for example, ultra-Orthodox Jews who refuse to sit next to women on flights should be called out for their bigotry and their misogyny. But there is something very insidious about these anti-Semitic worldviews and these sort of attempts at revisionism to downplay the Holocaust or to even say it didn't happen. It sickens me to the core because there is extensive evidence that it did. Not just the survivors, but German archives themselves. This is the thing. The perpetrators documented it. Of course, there were attempts after the war to destroy that evidence, but it just sickens me that it doesn't take too much digging into the internet to see where these theories prevail today, and it's very disturbing. So for that reason, it is critical that it is remembered. Um, yeah, so I'll put a link to the Yad Vashem website. Check it out. I think it's a good concept because it keeps the memory of the victims alive. Yeah. And whilst, of course, all atrocities, in a fair world need to be recognised, I believe the crimes of communism need to be much more documented. I mean, I hope one day there is a film that does for the victims of Mao's terror what Schindler's List did to the Holocaust, did for the Holocaust in terms of keeping up that memory. But, having Holocaust Memorial Day, having these specific memorials, I think is very, very important. Okay, let me know your thoughts.